Hello everyone, welcome to our conversation piece following the announcements made on the 17th of November by the Chancellor in his autumn statement. My name is Sam Stent, I'm a tax advisor working mainly out of our Colchester office, and I have with me today Gavin Birchall, tax partner, Luke Morris, corporate finance partner, and Mark Smith, a director in our corporate finance team. Today we're going to be chatting about what the budget really means for both businesses and individuals. And to kick us off, whilst the Chancellor announced an extension of the energy price guarantee for individual homeowners, is there any help out there for businesses? I know for one business in Ipswich, the utility bills for their office space are scheduled to increase sixfold next year when their current contract expires. And that's going to take their annual bill from $30,000 to $180,000 a year. It's going to wipe out a large portion of their profits. What should businesses be doing in this situation? Are some businesses in danger of going under, do you think?
I think certainly it will have an impact on a lot of businesses. I think with the energy price cap, a lot of it is going to depend if you can pass those costs on. Some will be able to, some won't. I think in an office environment, what I'm quite keen to see is actually, I think a lot of offices will start to look at 4-day weeks. I think this could be a real driver for that, because if they can get the same level of outputs in a 4-day week, heating, lighting, all of those costs will reduce. But clearly from a £30,000 to £180,000 is a very significant increase.
There's no detail, was there, on the support for businesses as far as energy is concerned, and we've seen that illustration with a number of clients. I think particularly where you have manufacturing businesses, maybe they're doing high volume, low margin, highly reliant on energy inputs. It's basically wiping out the bottom line, so it's going to be a huge thing for them. But I think there's actually a wider point here, which is the thing that was missing from yesterday was anything about growth. There's nothing about growth. And it's my view is unless you have cheap, reliable energy, then growth is very difficult. So those two things come together. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why there wasn't so much said about it. But it's a massive concern.
I mean, the Chancellor did say that growth was one of the three primary focuses of it, but there wasn't any detail to support that ambition.
And it certainly, when you listen to it, it didn't come across as that, did it?
No.
There was nothing in there that you thought, actually, this has got a positive route, this can encourage investment.
Interestingly, when the previous government announced investment zones, creation of investment zones across the country, many local authorities submitted their plans for that to encourage investment in their region. And I noticed that Jeremy Hunt mentioned that they're going to refocus those onto be more closely aligned with places where there's university, so knowledge-intensive places.
Yeah.
But there was no firm commitment in that regard. They were very vague in terms of their intentions with that, and I think they used the words, "we're going to consider and consult" in relation to those. So that was a disappointing aspect from my perspective.
Mark, you mentioned some businesses might be going down to a 4-day week.
Yeah.
Is the assumption then that employees will be working from home the other day?
I think there'll be some of that, but I think actually businesses I speak to are looking at the possibility of a 4-day week, per se.
I think also you've got to remember, not every business can have people working from home. If you're working on a production line, you have to be in.
Yeah, because it's not only businesses that are struggling with fuel costs, of course, individuals are as well. And if you're asking staff to work at home, then their own personal costs are going to be going up. Whilst they might be saving on the travel on one hand and not coming into the office, a lot of people aren't going to want to work at home and have to put the heating on for an extra 8 hours. Is there any way that employers can help staff with their the cost of living crisis at the moment?
I think there's every business is having the challenge with recruitment, and I think there's some discussions going on at the moment with what businesses need to do to deal with these really unprecedented rates of inflation and the cost of living. But I think there's also going to be an element of employers having to have honest conversations with staff as well, and talking about just the extent of the challenges that those businesses are facing. So I think it's probably going to be a two-way process. It'll be interesting to see how it pans out over the coming year.
You mentioned that people are having problems with recruitment. I mean, I know that one of our clients who provides security services is having to turn away work because they can't get staff. Yet the Chancellor mentioned in his speech yesterday that there are 630,000 economically inactive adults in the UK. So how do you explain the recruitment problems?
I think I've actually looked at some of this stuff. I think there's one extraordinary statistic is 500,000 people over 50 haven't returned to the workforce after COVID. So, I mean, that was a shocking event. And I guess a lot of people have taken that as an opportunity to reassess priorities, take early retirement or whatever. But the other thing in the data, and this is over the last year, you have 300,000 more people on long-term sickness as well. So, I think those individuals, whether it's because they've decided to take early retirement or whether because they've got sickness issues, they're outside of the workforce now. So it's a big challenge, and obviously there's a lot of stuff in the news at the moment about immigration as well, and that was of course what Liz Truss was wanting to do, was to try and plug that hole a little bit by easing up on immigration. So I don't see this challenge going away that quickly. Of course, the thing that could happen is next year when we sort of see a bit of a shake-up in the labour market, businesses facing challenges, maybe that will ease it a little bit for certain businesses, but generally I think it's a big problem. It's kind of structural.
It's interesting, it's not necessarily a UK problem either, is it? We've spoken to businesses overseas, in Europe and further afield, and they're all facing the same similar recruitment issues. So I know there's been lots of speculation as to whether Brexit has been partly a driver for this in terms of our restrictions on recruiting people from overseas to fill vacancies. But yeah, it's much wider than the UK, so it's maybe it is sort of a fallout from the pandemic in terms of different attitudes and illnesses as well.
I think and I don't know how that number of 630,000 is arrived at, but clearly there will be some of those that are in a position where they don't want to work and don't need to work.
No.
And then what we might see is some of those people being forced back into work over the next year or two.
Yeah.
Because if you can live on what you're currently generating as income, that's one thing. But if you're in a position where you've either got to change your lifestyle or go back to work or take part-time work, then that may well reduce that number to a number that you actually arrive at, which means those people that are unable to work as opposed to have chosen not to work.
Yeah, I think those inflationary pressures are certainly going to force a rethink amongst certain people who gave up work on the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the Chancellor mentioned a review of the benefit system, so I suspect that that is what they have in mind, to encourage people to return to work for economic reasons. I saw on our website actually that we have 27% of our workforce is students. So we're sort of obviously going in at the grassroots level and growing our own.
Yeah.
Is that a good strategy, do you think?
I think it's even more important to do that now, just to grow your own people, because it's difficult to find people with the skills that you need to develop a business. So if you can find people at an early part of their careers and help to develop those skills that you need, then it's a great way of trying to fill and develop the business. Really, it's just that it's obviously a long-term investment, and it doesn't help many businesses in the short term.
I think going back to your earlier one, I think if you can take people in young, you create some loyalty, and actually then you can offer more than saying, I'm just going to give you money, because I think a lot of firms have got through the recent years by offering any reward that's not financial, because inflation was 2%. When inflation is at 10-11%, you actually need cash. And those benefits that people offer, actually now you have to go above that.
Yeah. We're going to see a lot of jobs, I think, in our region, because the Chancellor gave the green light to the new nuclear plant at Sizewell. So is that going to be a bigger problem for recruitment?
I think, you would hope that a massive infrastructure project like that will require input from local contractors and subcontractors. So you'd hope that would create a strong ripple effect in the local economy, notwithstanding the fact that inevitably, given the specialist nature of constructing a nuclear power plant, you're going to need very specialist skills, which is going to require engaging people from overseas to do that. It's still going to create local recruitment pressures inevitably. So again, interesting to see there was very little sort of measures around immigration. It'd be interesting to see. I can't help feeling they're going to need to do something further in terms of incentivising people to come and move to the UK to do some of the essential work that's needed to fulfil these infrastructure projects.
Also, you talk to clients in the construction industry, and they are now seeing a slowdown. Now, I've never built a nuclear reactor, but whether any of those skills are transferable.
Yeah.
I can't even get somebody to come and build my front garden wall, Mark. So how they're going to build a nuclear reactor, I don't know.
I think the other thing with this I don't know if it was mentioned particularly yesterday, but it's the whole thing around productivity. So you've had that almost, well, at least a couple of decades where businesses had a ready supply of cheap labour, and so there wasn't that same incentive to invest in assets, in automation, in robotics, and all of that sort of stuff. So I suppose these kinds of pressures are perhaps going to speed up or incentivise businesses to be thinking more about that side of things. I mean, the productivity puzzle is something that no economists can really agree on what the real cause is. But what we do know is, on international measures, we're really low down the league table as a country.
I think it's difficult, isn't it, though, with the level of regulation that most businesses are subject to, the amount of employment-related costs that there are. And I know the government didn't go through with the going back on a 1.25% increase in employee NIC rate, but it's still very expensive to employ somebody, and allied with the regulatory costs, it's in some ways it's not hard to wonder, why there isn't a productivity there. Do you think? I mean, obviously Liz Truss, her agenda was very much towards deregulation and stimulating growth. Do you think there was something in her plans? I know that a lot of them have been sort of vilified.
Well, by vilified you mean they were going to get rid of the 45% rate, and now they've brought more people into it, so they've done a total 180 turn. So I suppose I think it was the bit that was missing for me with the mini budget, I think we call it. I'm losing track of what we call it. It was called the mini budget, right? Is it's kind of a one-sided accounting entry, because they talked about 50 billion of tax cuts, 70 billion of extra borrowing, but there was no sort of other side to that. What they did get was the market saying, we're not going to lend you any more money. That was effectively the response of markets, which should have been predictable, or at least sounded out, right? Yeah. So I think in principle what she was trying to do, had some merit, but what she shied away from doing is similar to what Jeremy Hunt has shied away from doing somewhat in this budget, is to say there's going to need to be cuts in expenditure as well. So the way I see this budget is effectively, instead of the debt plugging the gap, because nobody wants to lend us any money, taxpayers plugging the gap. So if you want the services, if you want the NHS, social care, education, they're the big ones. If we want that, then the taxpayer is going to have to pay for it. Why? Because the markets have told us that there's no more debt available.
Yeah.
I mean, on the subject of tax, we've seen the term fiscal drag everywhere. Some people are calling
it's
it
a Channel
stealth.
4 show, isn't it?
Or it's a stealth tax, isn't it? I mean, it's where allowances and stuff are frozen. More people get dragged into higher rate tax brackets, and with inflation at 10%, that it's going to have a huge impact, isn't it? Freezing all these allowances.
So some would say it's a very clever way of generating revenue, because you haven't got the highlight of tax rate increases with that.
I mean, I think on that, it comes back to the inflation measure. When inflation is at 2%, it's sort of palatable.
Yeah.
But at this level, I think, they're in real trouble.
Not the pensioners though, because they've got the triple lock guarantee.
Yes, I'm probably not allowed to say my view on that, but I would probably challenge the fact that we are now in a position where we are rewarding people that don't work more highly than we are rewarding those in work. Because I don't know anybody that's got a 10% pay rise.
Mm.
And then they wonder why
very-
there's 630,000 people that aren't in work.
Yeah, creates a very difficult dynamic, doesn't it? And you can see, you can see from the other side. Obviously, the government made those manifesto pledges, and they don't want to be seen to row back on any more measures than they've already rowed back on. But equally, you can see that that could be seen as very much
Protecting the grey vote, possibly.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, the VAT threshold's been frozen as well, hasn't it, Gavin?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that the government have looked at historically in terms of many European nations, for example. They either have no VAT threshold or a very low one. In this country, the VAT threshold has remained at £85,000. So any businesses with turnover less than that, they don't need to register for VAT. I think, obviously, with inflationary pressures, that will inevitably draw more businesses above the VAT threshold, and more businesses will need to become VAT registered.
Is that further going to fuel inflation, do you think? Because clients are now going to have to recover that extra cost,
Yeah,
and
so
that
I guess
passing it on to the consumer, maybe?
Yes, it's who bears that cost really is going to be interesting.
So we're at
That.
vicious circle.
Yeah.
And what about capital gains tax? I mean, the allowance there's not just been frozen; it's actually going to be halved over the next couple of years, down to 6,000 next year, with 3,000 the year after. Are many of our clients going to have to worry about that?
It's only those who own assets who are realising gains from disposals of assets. So it's a limited sector of the population. Historically, we've tended to always have a reasonable sized annual allowance. It's currently £12,300. Obviously, the new measures will reduce that heavily, and you can't help but thinking that they'll probably possibly look to eliminate it completely. I mean, it could draw more people into the sort of tax return world.
When you look at what they're doing on dividend tax, it seems to me they're just going to completely align the two. So whether your income is through earnings or through capital gains, you tax it the same way.
I think you're right. I think it's harmonisation. That's what it's going to eventually, isn't it? Surely. So my take on that was it seems like a lot of hassle for £25 million is what it raises per the OBR forecasts. And so you think, I mean, that is a lot. I mean, you probably spend that in HMRC administration to change things. It just seems.
True. It was interesting the fact that they've got rid of that 1.25% employee NIC increase, but they kept it on the dividend tax. So you can sort of see that. At the same time, though, with the government lifting corporation tax rates from 19% to 25%, it's starting to make it quite expensive to operate a business through a company. Many family businesses are owner managed.
So lots of clients are going to be talking about the old dividend salary thing again, aren't they? And I suppose there's going to be some conversations that we'll need to have with them about the timing of that, when they're taking dividends, when they're taking salaries, and probably some nasty surprises in there that they need to be ready for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just discussing actually with one of the directors in the private client team, and for the first time it's actually going, at a certain level anyway, going to be more efficient to take salary rather than dividends. So there's going to have to be profit extraction reviews, I think, for lots of people to see, typically the low salary, high dividend model that people have used, for years is not going to be the best option for a lot of people. I want to talk about electric cars. I think some of you have got them actually.
I was going to say, we haven't really talked about the environment yet. But I can't help feeling that that's going to be a very important factor over the next 10 years.
Well, we've talked about net zero in the context of energy costs in the context of growth. So it's fundamentally there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I know that when I talked at the budget breakfast last year, there was a discussion around whether the government's measures to encourage people to go electric were effective or successful. But yesterday they announced that electric car drivers are going to pay road tax from 2025. Yeah. So that's surely going to be a deterrent for people going green, isn't it?
I'm not convinced that it's just because if you're spending 50, 60k on an electric car, the fact you might have to pay £300 road tax a year, I think that will have negligible effect. And I think actually it's probably about the right time because you've created the interest through the low tax system. Now you tax people. I think that's one of the few things that I would probably support.
I think longer term there won't be any petrol or diesel cars anyway, right? So what is the consumer choice going to be? It's going to be electric or nothing. I'd be really interested to look at some sums on the actual cost of owning, operating an electric vehicle, particularly in light of electricity costs in the next few years. It'd be quite interesting to do that comparison.
Yeah. Okay. And interest rates. The government's raised interest rates, says it's going to curb inflation. I've only got an A-level in economics, and I know people here know much more than I do. But if the inflation isn't being caused by excessive consumption, it's apparently being caused by Vladimir Putin, and we're already in a recession, how is putting the interest rates up going to help us? And isn't it going to... What about all our clients with properties? What's it going to mean for them?
Well, I don't have an A-level in economics, but I like to sort of stick my oar in on these subjects. You know, you mentioned the last presentation we did, and I don't know if you remember, but I did some slides around inflation and where that was going. And at the time, that was before the incursions into the Ukraine. It was before everybody was paying 4 times as much as they are now for their gas bills. But it seemed very obvious to me that the Bank of England's projections were very wrong for a simple reason, which is the fundamental reason, a cause for inflation, which is about the supply of money. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And I think it's useful for people to look at it from that perspective, because I think we're kind of conditioned, aren't we, into thinking that inflation is about a basket of goods that changes every now and again, and the news reports the pork sausages are coming out, the vegetarian sausages are going in to reflect consumer habits. But it's really not like that. It's not about costs of products increasing. It's about the value of the pound, the currency that you have, decreasing, and that's all to do with the supply of money. That's gone from 25% before 2008 of GDP to around 50% after the credit crisis, to 100% now. 500 billion pounds spent for the COVID response. 40 billion of that in fraud. We know about that. It's been widely reported. 37 billion on things like the NHS Test and Trace app. Do you remember that? So things like that have all contributed to this sort of perilous level of indebtedness, which, by the way, the presentation yesterday doesn't really go anywhere to addressing that. It talks about the debt to GDP moving from 97.6 to 97.3, so minuscule in the next few years, despite those tax rises, because that's all being spent. So I see the reason for inflation being all around money not being sound. That's fundamentally the problem. And the bank doesn't really have the levers to deal with it. If inflation's at 11%, then what use is a 3% interest rate, right? It's simple mathematics. That's not going to have any real impact.
It's something that's not really being talked about too much in terms of the potential longer-term impact of the furlough scheme, CBILS loans, and the other COVID sort of recovery measures. But it's you can't help feel, I think if you also look at the Bank of England policy of quantitative easing, create more cash into the markets, which minimised the impact to an extent of the global financial crisis, but it's, I guess, had a longer term impact in terms of the value of...
It had the effect of removing the liability from the bank stockholders to the taxpayer. I mean, that's what it did.
But surely there's got to be a large part of this inflationary issue caused by Ukraine.
Well, that's where it doesn't help, does it?
No.
But I think the trajectory was very apparent last October or whenever it was we met.
I think it was interesting because if everybody I know that I spoke to during COVID, we all knew we would have to pay for it at some stage. And I think the government have missed a trick because they haven't specifically said X percent is going to repay the COVID, or we're going to put a penny on income tax to pay for COVID. Everybody I know was expecting that, and now it's all been wrapped up in this effectively a huge fundraising exercise.
Yeah, I mean the way they see it is like structural debt, right? So it's there forever. So they're not really talking about repaying debt. They're talking about servicing interest. And I guess the interesting thing about interest at the moment is with rates at this level, the repayment of government interest is 120 billion a year next year. So I mean that's bigger than education. It's bigger than defence. It's bigger than every other government budget apart from the NHS.
I think
so that's the scale of it.
I think the man on the street is not particularly concerned about whether the government's got to pay 120 billion in their interest payments. What they're interested in is how much their mortgage has gone up.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a lot of buy-to-let landlords and other clients who are going to really feel the pinch of that, aren't we?
Yeah, I'll add to that. With buy-to-let landlords, many of them own the properties personally, so they can't get full tax relief on the interest costs. So I think what could happen is the buy-to-let landlord to exit the market, and then it's a case of does that then cause some wider stir in terms of housing and
Well, then you get a shortage of supply in the rental sector, and then rental prices will go up 10 or 15% a year.
Yeah, it's, I think the government probably acknowledged the fact that the Bank of England probably acknowledged the fact that pushing up interest rates isn't going to have a massive impact initially. They've certainly, the government's growth forecasts in terms of the government's predictions on inflation are quite sort of modest in terms of how long that's going to take for the inflationary rates to reduce. So my impression is the government Bank of England are kind of sort of recognising the fact that there are other factors out there beyond the Ukraine crisis.
I think I'm one of them, so that the Bank of England were incredibly slow to increase interest rates. And when they did it, they kept doing by 0.25%, whereas I think what they should have done is done 0.5%, 0.75% very early on.
But they probably had the European Central Bank in that regard, although a bit behind the Federal Bank in the US.
Because someone said, as a Bank of England, you've only got one job, which is to keep inflation under control, and they haven't.
I mean, the other rates that we've seen sort of going up and down, particularly since the mini budget, are foreign exchange rates, and we've got a lot of clients who are going to be relying on imports and exports, and have already had to deal with the Brexit fallout.
Yeah. We saw yesterday there was an announcement of removing import tariffs on the various goods, but I can't help feeling that's probably more of a big highlight statement, which probably doesn't have a lot of depth to it in terms of the number of products that are going to be covered by that, and it's certainly not going to really materially alter the massive extra cost that foreign exchange rates are having at the moment, given the strength of the pound at the moment.
Picking up on some other things that the Chancellor mentioned yesterday, he said he wants to tackle fraud in R&D tax relief, so research and development, where companies are, looking to create new products or ideas. And he says he wants to cut some of the mention. He said he wants to tackle fraud in R&D tax relief, R&D being research and development, where companies are looking to develop new technologies.
I don't know if he's looking to tackle the fraud. More, I think he's sort of acknowledging there's probably been a misuse of the scheme. I mean, I saw somewhere that the government had announced part of money for HMRC to combat serious fraud. Whether he means combating businesses that have claimed research and development tax relief when in fact they weren't eligible to do so. I'm not clear at this point. But certainly they've allocated a significant sum of money to combat serious fraud. That could be related to fraud from the furlough scheme or CBILS loans.
I think it's been an incredibly generous scheme. I think certainly things I was hearing was that whilst the rules hadn't changed, HMRC were taking a closer look. And I actually don't think at the levels they're talking about it will discourage people from incurring R&D costs, because it's still a generous relief, just not as generous as it was before.
Yeah.
Do you think it might just deter people from claiming the relief? Because then
No, I don't. No, I think they'll still claim it because it's still a generous relief.
I guess though, if we're talking about maybe foreign businesses who want a sort of a presence in the UK and who want to do research and development here, particularly with our strong life sciences sector, question mark will be around whether, if you compare the R&D type reliefs that we have in the UK to other European countries or in the US, for example, the reduction in the level of relief could make us less competitive and a less enticing country to invest. Having said that, if you've got a strong sort of life science sector, then you would hope that would override aspects such as the level of tax relief that you get on expenditure on research and development.
My take on this was that they were, because you've got the two schemes, haven't you, for the larger companies and for the smaller companies, and so you sort of imagine that there's again some thoughts about simplifying, harmonising the two, perhaps longer term, and maybe taking smaller businesses out of it, because I've no doubt. I mean, they want to attract big corporates, really, don't they? That's what they're interested in. So presumably that's what they will do. And I think the other point on it, that from just practice and my experience, is in the early days of the scheme, I don't know, I've been so close to it recently, but it felt that, how much of this is brought on by HMRC themselves, because it felt like a lot of these claims were just going through on the nod,
I think,
without a great deal of scrutiny.
I think there's certainly been a lack of scrutiny of claims, and also I think that many businesses will have claimed the release and think actually that's the end of the story. But obviously, there's always the prospect of HMRC challenging those claims if they're within the relevant time limits. So it'd be interesting to see what happens over the next few years in terms of previous claims that have been made. But certainly there has to be a question as to whether that relief has achieved its intended objectives in the fullest of manner.
So, before we wrap up, has anyone got any other comments on yesterday's announcements?
I mean, personally, I just came away feeling, I felt that it was a tax grab, really. That was my kind of overall Sun headline summary. There was not very much positive in it. There was very little in terms of growth. But the cynic in me says that a lot of this is aligning to the electoral timeline, isn't it? So it's getting that sort of bad stuff out of the way, so that come 18 months, 2 years down the line, there can maybe be a few sweeteners that are maybe dragged out when things perhaps look a little bit better.
Because 2 years is still a long time away, and there's still time for some positive economic news to come out. And whilst the Conservatives may well have written off the next election, I don't think they really have. And I think there is still time for them to turn around, because 2 years is a long time. And we could be coming out of recession, possibly interest rates could be lower, could be at 4%. And I think you're right, Luke. I think he's gambling everything on all of the bad news now, in the hope that in 2 years' time there may be some positive news coming out.
Perhaps there's an element of let's really get the bad news as bad as possible, so that maybe in a year's time, when we're closer to an election, there's going to be good news. So maybe I'm too cynical, but it'd be interesting to see what happens.
It's not like me to be more optimistic than Luke, but I think on this I am.
We'll see what happens over the next couple of years. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with any of the team to discuss the autumn statement, You can reach out to them directly by calling 0330 058 6559, or you can email hello@Scrutton Bland. Thank you for listening, and we hope to bring you more updates like this soon.